Okay, great. So I think we're good to go. I'm just going to say a quick hello, and then I'm going to hand it over to Kat to introduce herself and kick things off. So we have probably a handful of slides here. We're going to go over just some things that we sort of see as issues and important pieces related to match, and then we'll save room for questions and answers at the end. And like I said, we are an informal bunch, so feel free to interrupt and ask questions along the way. You don't have to wait till the Q&A at the end. I'm happy to hear from anybody at any point. I'm Kayla Tavares. I am a planner over at North Country Council. One of the things I do, you'll see me in a few different places, but is work on our Economic Development Partnership Planning Program. And that's kind of what one of the pieces we're using to put together this webinar today. Now I'll hand things over to Kat.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kat. I'm the planning specialist at the North Country Council. Small little disclaimer, my cat loves to come in as soon as Zoom starts, and she's now on my desk. So if you hear any meowing, I'm sorry. So this is our What is Match webinar. There we go. So today we'll cover what is match, where does match come from, why is match important, what is a funding stack, why does it matter, and then, as Kayla said, we'll leave time for questions and answers. So first, I want to give some background on the CEDS, which is the Comprehensive Development Strategy, which is a locally based group of community leaders that focus on economic development. They facilitate economic development and job creation. They provide coordination between public and private sector organizations. And the federal EDA funding allows staff to offer a variety of services to communities, including this match webinar. So to kick things off, what is match? So match is the money an applicant is responsible for covering when applying for a grant, because a funder rarely covers all of a project. And there are two types of match, one being cash match and the other being in-kind match. Cash is pretty self-explanatory. It's money that goes right towards the project. And in-kind is donations of things or time. So time can be staff time working on a project, and things could be something like machinery or real estate. Kayla, I'll let you take it from there.
So one of the things I want to talk about a little bit is, where does match actually come from, right? So whenever you're putting a project together, there's usually pieces of funding that come from different places to make it all happen. Some of the likely suspects are, there's a lot of government funding that's available that can be used as match, and that can come at different levels, right? That can be federal grant opportunities like we see through the Economic Development Administration, through HUD perhaps. We can also sometimes see these come through in things like the new congressionally designated spending projects that are being supported by the state representatives down in Washington, D.C. themselves. Sometimes we see state funding get into play, right? There is state funding available through organizations like New Hampshire Housing, or through BEA sometimes, or sometimes even through the Office of Planning and Development, or from New Hampshire Environmental Services, right, and DES. And then other times it can come through money that's available a little more locally, right? There's kind of all stages of government that can have a hand in funding projects. Recently, on sort of the county and municipal level, we've seen some communities putting their ARPA funding that came out during the COVID-19 pandemic to use as match in projects to help fund things like, broadband expansion in places and different pieces like that, or small projects like improvements to a community center building that's really just in a little bit of rough shape. And so one place to sort of look at pieces are those government funding sources. They tend to be some of our big funding streams. Separate Separate from that, there's also, you know, a little bit more we see in state programming that isn't necessarily from the federal level, right? New Hampshire has a very strong charitable giving network, right? And the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation can sometimes be a great match for other funding projects. Specific grants we see are things like Northern Borders Regional Commission grants, which we're actually right now, the funding year is just kicking off for them for their application period, but that's one that's, you know, specific to Northern New Hampshire communities. And we also see things like, this is kind of the alphabet soup pieces, right? We see the US Department of Agriculture sometimes can come in and pay for a piece of a project, community development block grants, which start federal, but then they're handed down through the state New Hampshire Community Development Finance Authority. Those can be used too. So really the idea here is there's a lot of different places that can come together to help you match. When you find one funding source you're looking for, oftentimes you end up having to look at sort of who else funds this similar type of work. And on the right-hand side of the screen, I'm going to jump a little bit out of order here and say, there's a link here to a funding hub that we've been working on putting together for a while on our website that gives an idea of who funds what sort of things and when their application cycles are and how to sort of get in touch with those funders. And so it's an important piece to think about who else funds those similar types of work, right? Housing is something that can be funded by a low-income housing tax credit. It can also be funded through HUD itself, and it can be funded through community development block grants, right? And so oftentimes you find there are multiple funders who are interested in funding a certain type of work. When it's economic development, EDA is often a huge player. NBRC can get involved very easily. USDA gets involved a lot. And like I said, CDBG as well. Not all matches public money though. And a lot of times there's a threshold or a ceiling on how much public money is used in a project. A lot of times, especially this is true when we're working on economic development projects, they like to see that there's some private money coming in. Private money is things like if you're going to build out a roadway or do some expansion to some infrastructure, and the hope is that you're going to open up space for new businesses to move in. If those businesses are planning to build a building and you know who they are, a lot of times you can use their money that they're going to use to invest in those properties as match to your project. And private money is sort of an important piece because, like I said, sometimes you'll find there's a ceiling or a cap on how much federal money for sure you see, but usually private money being in the mix really speaks to something that we hear as being popular with almost all funders right now, which is public-private partnerships. They want to see that what's being invested in with public money is supported by private entities in the community as well. So those options for sort of private money, they're not just businesses directly saying, yes, I'm going to, you know, build this X dollar figure building on the property. Sometimes it's things like loans. I mean, debt can oftentimes be part of a project that has to come into play. We always like grant money best, right? Because grant money's and sometimes usually referred to as kind of free money, right? But loans can be part of this equation too. And specifically when you're working in that economic development space, there are organizations across the region, like our regional development corporations. Coos County has its own regional development corporation. Grafton County has a unique one to itself. In Carroll County, there's a Mount Washington Valley Economic Council. And then there's also another group called NCIC, the Northern Communities Investment Corporation. And all of those are actual lenders, right? And so they can sometimes help if you have a gap in your project that can't be funded elsewhere. Those are lenders who are a little bit more flexible than banks usually are. They're able to invest in different sorts of projects. They don't need to see the same sort of profit returns and things that a bank might need when they look at lending, but they're interesting places to look at closing a gap, and that money counts as match too. Another piece is you might just find that there are business groups who are willing to contribute to something. This happens a lot in things like a technical assistance program. So if there's workforce training that's trying to get funded, and you have a particular industry group who's going to benefit from it, like a forest products industry group, sometimes they'll collect donations on their own and then bring them into the play. And the last piece, and this sort of overlaps with that government sources up at the beginning a bit, is local match, right? And sometimes this is, I believe, kind of the trickiest one to put together, right? Is sometimes you can just go, if you are working on a project that's really going to benefit a community, say you're building a new community center in your town, you can sometimes go straight to your town funding and ask for a budget request to help support something like that. Towns can do some sort of interesting other pieces too that can help count towards match sometimes, like do some tax relief for a project they want to see come forward. And the benefits of those can actually be calculated out and sometimes used as match. So if, say, you're going to invest in a new building, or there's a private entity that's coming into town to redevelop an old site, sometimes you can actually put in place a structure locally to forgive or lessen the tax burden on that new developed property for a while. And the value of that tax relief can actually sometimes count as match too. So there's some interesting ways to do it. Local match can be tricky to get because it really needs a lot of local support to pass. And you have to be planning a bit in advance to either put the foundations in place or to, make sure you're getting a budget request and that you're getting it widely supported enough that it can make it onto the ballots and that people will sort of vote in favor of it and see the real benefit. But really, match is a tricky point for a lot of projects, right? I think oftentimes we all hope that that one application we write is going to fund the work we want to do in its whole, and very rarely is it the case. So what we kind of wanted to do with this slide is just kind of set the stage, paint some examples of there's a lot of different places to look. And sometimes it's just taking the time to look or reaching out to people who can help you figure out where to look. So why is match important? I think this is sort of like a silly point to make, but it's also kind of important, right? Is why do they ask for match, right? And really there's a few different reasons. They, and by they, I mean any funder, right? So you can fill in whatever funder you have in your mind whose grant application says, we'd like to know about your matching funds. They usually are interested in learning that you have matching funds because it shows commitment to the project, right? It shows that this wasn't something that you only thought to ask them for, but it's something that you are elsewise committed to doing. You've got other people lined up, you've looked for funding in other places, and it really shows an effort, right? That you're committed to getting this done. The other piece is projects are expensive. Gosh, they're literally almost always more expensive than you think, right? They're very expensive to get done, and having match that's ready, that you can use, helps the funder realize that when they put their money in, this project's going to get done. So a lot of funding buckets have a timeline to be used. Some of it's quick, right? A year, 2, 3 years. Sometimes they're a little slower. Sometimes you can get 7, 8 years to get a project done. But a lot of times when you write those applications, they want to see that you have match ready or other match sources lined up, because it shows them that your money is that their money they invest is going to be able to be put to use by you quickly. And as somebody who sort of works behind the scenes on a lot of projects, it's interesting to find out that sometimes people can't get the rest of the match together, right? And the funds have to be returned. And that is usually a funder's least favorite situation, right? Once they award a project money, they really just want to see that project get done. And so, yes, you can get extensions. Yes, you can make adjustments, but really they want to see match because it helps them know that when they write that check to you, you're going to be able to move. You're ready to sort of make things go here. And then the last piece, and I think I've probably already said this 4 times, so bear with me, is there are almost no funders who will pick up the whole bill of a project. And so when you have a project that needs to get done, you almost always need to be looking for match. On the right side of the screen here is a list of pieces where, to this point, of funders very rarely pick up the entire bill of a project. These are some pretty common funders we see around and how much of a project they will fund in maximum, right? USDA, they vary quite a bit. Sometimes between 50, sometimes you can find funding sources at USDA that will pay for the entirety of a project. But they too, they're sort of looking at a variable amount of the percent of a project they're willing to fund. For the Economic Development Administration, almost all the time, they will only pick up half the bill, right? 50% of the project they're willing to see come from their funding usually. In certain situations, they're willing to see that go up to 80%, but it's really only in very specific situations, and each kind of grant opportunity would spells out for you in those publications they make about how to apply, about what percentage, when. Community development block grants usually will max out at about 70% of a project that they will fund. Oftentimes in economic development, I see them pick up about 50% of the bill for a project. Northern Borders Regional Commission grants, again, they are somewhere in between 50 and 80% of a project cost. And that depends on how distressed the area that's being served is. And so they publish every year a list of the communities and individual towns and what percentage of a project they would fund there. But again, right, they almost all have a piece that they're not willing to fund, right? That they want to see you have the commitment and the funds and the availability to put other things to use here, that they're not the only one who thinks this is a good project. Even our congressionally designated spending projects, which are new, right? Those have just been in the last 3, maybe 4 now, years. We've seen direct funding coming through the federal government through our representatives down in Washington. And even those usually will not pick up more than 80% of the project costs. Overall, when you're using any federal funding, there's almost always an 80% maximum investment from federal partners. So you almost always, even if you're combining, say, an NBRC funding application with an EDA funding application, you're almost always going to find that you can't stack those two together, right? And say, well, EDA will pay 50%, NBRC will pay 50%, there's 100% of my project funded. There's almost always a federal cap of 80% federal funds in a project. And again, it goes to the same piece. They want to see that they're not the only ones committed to seeing the project done, and that you've done your work to find other entities and other places to fund pieces. Okay, so what do these look like? So if anybody's ever put together grant applications, and I'm looking at some of the people in the room, and I know you all have, you are almost always asked to put together a budget form, right, of how much money is coming from where. And before you get to that application stage, when you're starting to just put together your project, we call these your funding stack, right? What pieces are you going to stack together to get to that total cost of a project? And I wanted to sort of, introduce that idea here, because what I end up seeing a lot of times is it's important to start working on that funding stack usually before you're writing a grant application. Because in that grant application, they will almost always ask you who else you've applied for the money from and when you are going to receive those awards, if you've applied to other places or if you already have that funding in hand to use. So sometimes this is just an important piece of when you start to initially figure out a project you want to do, you almost need to start thinking about the funding stack right from the very beginning. Because when you start to write those applications, they want you to usually have already submitted or have those other funders in your funding stack lined up. And so you can almost be a little bit behind the ball right when you start if you wait until you're filling out grant applications to think about your funding stack. I wanted to show you guys two different sort of examples of funding stacks. This is a simple one. And on the next screen, we'll look at one that's like a little bit more complicated. So this actually goes pretty similar and follows the way that we actually fund our economic development planning assistance to towns. And these are the actual numbers, but it's just kind of simple and easy. So when we go to EDA and this is North Country Council, right? We apply as the designated economic development district for funding to do things like this, right? And to help with individual questions about putting together projects. When we go in, we say EDA was only ever willing to pay half of those planning and technical assistance costs. So what we do is we use a combination of, like Kat said in the beginning, cash match and in-kind sort of donation match to do that. So for, say, every $10,000 we ask for from EDA, we'd put up, say, $5,000 in staff salaries outside of EDA funding that we use for the same purpose. And we seek that from different funding sources sometimes. Recently, we've been doing a lot of help around the idea of workforce housing. And so we'll find some other funders to help us support workforce housing developments going forward and use that to count towards this because it's a similar scope of work. But the other piece we use is in-kind. And this is a piece where in-kind match is great. It's a little more complicated to pay attention to because you usually have to track the amount of time and hours people put in to help. But in-kind is donated value, and it can be people, right? It can be experts who participate in committees, come to meetings, help guide and direct a project. Sometimes if you're building something, it can be a local architect or an engineering firm that that's rooted in the community and willing to sort of donate some of their profit margins and their time from staff into helping get this done. And you almost always have to sort of back it up, right? And figure out how many hours are being put in by people and what that rate of time for them is, which basically means for every hour of time they give you, what's the dollar figure? It always has to get sort of translated back into dollar figures when you're using it as match. And the other piece where in-kind contributions can come from quite a bit is donations. So you might think of donations as somebody donating materials, right? For example, if you have a local building supply company that's willing to donate the tile to redo the flooring in a building you're rehabbing or something, those values can be considered in-kind contributions. They're donated value. But it can also be things like if you're having community discussions to figure out a project you're working on and you're constantly meeting at your local community center, but your community center usually or can rent out their spaces at, say, $500 for an afternoon. If you're not paying that fee, you can count that as a donation of space and time, right? That somebody else is showing that they have interest. And so you can, in-kind is an interesting one. It's a good way to fill small gaps in your project. Usually funders don't want to see all of your match coming from in-kind just because it tends to be a little bit hard to track and it doesn't add up very quickly. But when you have small gaps in your project, you can really think about who else is helping you get it done and can their time count as, this in-kind volunteered effort. Another place where, actually I was just thinking, another place where in-kind is sort of very interesting is if you were going to do a workforce training program, right? If you had a set of businesses, like say childcare providers, where like, we know we need more childcare providers. We also know we need more space, but we also need more knowledgeable, educated childcare providers. You actually might be able to work with, say, the local community college or your local high school's career and technical training programs, and then use the time of those teachers in that classroom as, in-kind contributions. So you can get creative with in-kind sometimes. All right, here's a more complicated funding stack. So this is for something actually being built. This is from a project that was applied for several years ago to rehab an old mill building and you turn it into like a business incubator space for new businesses. And so this one, as you can see, this one took a little bit more organization to come together. Now, because it's using federal funds, you'll see that they were held to the same piece as a maximum of 80% of the grant cost could come from a federal source. Overall, the project on this cost on this is a little over $1 million. And you can see what they've sort of put together here. to put together a little bit of a funding stack, right? They've used some USDA rural development funding to help them with an appraisal on the property and the environmental assessment, right, of what needed to be done, if were there any strange chemicals, any remediation or cleanup, or what the environmental impact of that was going to be. And so that came in for a pretty low amount of money, but it'd come in early in the project. So that they sought about $15,000 for that. They put a little bit of their own cash in hand on this, right? So the applicant themselves said, we have $2,000 in our budget we can put into that project planning. And, you know, in a project that cost over $1 million, 2,000 isn't a very big drop in the bucket to put in, but having cash on hand and not donating, but contributing your own resources looks very good to funders. They always want to see that, you know, your money is where your mouth is, that you have a little bit of direct contribution to this too. So this comes in as a little bit of cash match here. Then they actually seek in this one 2 rounds of EDA funding, right? They go to the Economic Development Administration for first round engineering and design of how to rehab this space, how this needs to get reconfigured, and paying an architect and engineer to really figure out exactly what's going to happen here. So they sought $25,000 in federal funding there. They then went to the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation to come up with the rest of that budget for that design and engineering, another $25,000. And that's actually, I have a typo in this, so I apologize, because the type is not a federal grant sought there, right? That's charitable fund money from the state level. So that's philanthropic money. Then when they started getting around to the actual construction and building of things, they used New Hampshire DES funding to help with environmental remediation. I think there's EPA money that actually is sort of behind the scenes at DES, but it comes through as a state funding source when it goes through the hands at DES. They then went back to EDA for money for construction and looked for $400,000 from them for that. And then they went to the New Hampshire Community Development Finance Authority, so CDFA tax credit program, for the other $400,000 they expected to need for construction. And tax credit programs through CDFA are a great place to look for project match. It's an interesting one if people aren't familiar with tax credits. The idea is they would basically sell a tax credit interest to any businesses who want to sort of write off some of their tax implications by making a donation to something. And CDFA actually manages those projects and will shop them out for projects when you apply to work with their tax credit program. So that one used this. And so as you can see, there's a little bit of a bunch of different stuff in here, right? There's a little bit of their own cash on hand, as available, right? You don't always, and very rarely do people have their own budget to write a large check on things, but showing a little bit of it actually makes things much more competitive usually when you're applying for applications. And then it's a mix of state, charitable, and federal funding they use to really make this thing go. All right. So this slide is called Why Does Match Matter? But really I'm going to flip that around and say what matters about match, right? And so there's a little call out box to the side that says details matter, right? Each different funder has different requirements for their match, what they're willing to accept, the timing of it, and how it's all sort of going to work. So some of the things to be really paying attention to when you're reading a funding opportunity and you're thinking about applying is think about how much federal money can be used for a project. A lot of times federal funders are a big component of our project funding. And like I said, oftentimes you'll find there's this ceiling of no more than 80% of a project can be paid for with federal funds. There are exceptions to that, right? There's exceptions to almost everything, but usually that's a pretty good rule of thumb to keep on hand. Sometimes, like I said, projects like the Economic Development Administration's Public Works and Economic Adjustment Funds, which is a big funding bucket in EDA that gets used very often for all sorts of different workforce training or infrastructure build out projects, a lot of times they'll have a maximum of 50%. And some funders will let you use in kind, right? While others won't. And so it's important when you start looking at application materials, think about what they allow and what they don't, right? Because just because one has allowed something doesn't mean the other one will. They all have their own little quirks and nuts and bolts. And so I honestly pull out a highlighter and I highlight them as I'm reading through so that I can just pay attention to all those little details. And I usually make myself a little cheat sheet of what do I and don't I know yet about how I'm going to put together that funding stack and how these different funders might feel about that funding stack. That second piece is really time limits and timing, right? Most grant awards have a time limit to complete the work. Earlier this morning, there was a Northern Borders Regional Commission funding webinar that I think several of us were all on. But so for example, when an NBRC award goes out, you have 3 years to expend those funds. And so that's different than others. You might find that an EDA project gives you 7 years to complete the work, but you need to understand what that timing is for your funders. Usually the purpose of those time limits isn't to just penalize people, it's really to make sure that their investments get out the door. It takes a lot of time for them to continue to monitor and manage projects. And so they want to see that they're not funding projects that aren't ready yet. Sometimes they'll call this ripeness of a project, right? How ready is your project? Is it hanging on the vine, ready to go, or does it still take a little bit more time to get there? And so they'll have time limits on expending their funds, usually just because they want to see it for their own efficiency of managing, get out the door. But they also want to see that the funding they're allocating or earmarking to different projects is going to get used, right? It's not going to sit there forever. Another important piece about timing is, and we have seen this more in the last 5 years than I think in the 15 years prior to this, is the costs of projects keep changing drastically. I have been looking at some budgets for paving, and the cost of paving I've watched go up threefold in 18 months. And so it's important that sometimes the timing requests go in because your estimates of what a project cost might not hold true for very long. And that's been really very true, since 2020 and forward, is prices have been changing drastically. And so once the money is awarded out, they want to know that you're going to have enough money to get the project done. And sometimes the timelines are really there to make sure that you don't end up in that situation where 18 months down the road, you're finally going out for that project and you realize that the money you'd stacked together is nowhere near enough anymore. That's sort of a sad news side of it, but it's a little bit of a reality of the world we've been working in lately. And the other thing on timing is about funding stacks. And this is where funding stacks become an art and a science and a little bit trickier than just putting numbers on the sheet. Is in addition to those time limits, some funders will have rules about when the funds you have, your other matching funds, when they count and when they can be spent. So for example, sometimes a funder will tell you, you can't count funding you have already spent before you apply to them for money. So if, for example, you say, well, I've already spent $70,000 in design and engineering on this, and now I'm going out for construction. Sometimes you'll find they won't let you count that $70,000 in design and engineering work as match for the project because it was spent before you applied for the grant. And so again, this is one of those times, pull out the highlighter, phone a friend, figure out kind of what are the nitty-gritty little details about matching funds, because these can become a little bit of a conundrum, really, right? They're a little bit of, these are the hoops that come along with the grants. And so it's important to understand how long you have to spend the project money, right? How long to get it done, but also how closely you have to coordinate the spending of different parts of your project to still count them as match. The last piece I want to talk about is match money in hand. So sometimes there's rules about how I'm sort of tripping on how to say this, sorry guys. But basically there's a piece on whether or not you can count it as match yet. So for example, if I were to apply for community development block grant funding for an EDA project to do technical assistance to help, businesses create new jobs, they actually are going to require me to already have a commitment for my match. So if, like I said in my example earlier, CDBG is going to pick up 50% of this project, and I need to come up with my other half the project costs in match, they're actually not going to let me say, I have applied for funding from the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation for the other half of the money. They're actually going to tell me to submit my application and get my award, I need to already have that funding awarded to my project. And this is where you can get into a little bit of a house of cards with match. Is some funders are okay being the first ones in, and others want to come in at the top here when they know you've already got the other pieces lined up and committed to you. So that's another time where it's important to, like I said, reach out to somebody who knows the funding source well. A lot of these funders have their own project officers, but then there are other people who've just done the projects before who can help you sort of think them through. And it's important to know whether or not they're going to require you to have that match in hand, or whether or not they're going to give you a period of time to secure the rest of your match before they, will let you move forward. And some look at it differently. And that's the piece where it's important to kind of dig into the details of each funder. And like I said, jokingly, right, phone a friend, talk to somebody who's used the funding before. Certainly feel free to reach out to us. We help a lot of people put together funding stacks and look at projects and manage the administration of a lot of grants. And so sometimes we'll know how much wiggle room you can get from who on whether or not having just submitted the other application is going to be close enough, or whether or not you need an award, or whether or not you need that cash already in hand to do the work. So I think that gets us to kind of the end of what we wanted to throw out as starting points and thinking about match for your projects. I'll sort of share, I guess, the background for us holding this event was really around the fact that we invited the Economic Development Administration project officer up to do a tour of some projects people were thinking of in the region last summer. And it was a great day. It was actually 2 days. We saw projects all across the region, from wastewater plant build outs to mill site redevelopment work to industrial parks that are trying to get a little bit more new life and new opportunity in them. And when we left those meetings, our EDA field representative for New Hampshire said, these were great projects. Let's see some applications. And when we started working on the application pieces, we realized match is a real struggle point for everybody, right? It's hard to figure out how to coordinate different funding sources. It's hard to figure out who to go to first to look for funding. And so we figured it's great to just start a conversation. And that was our hope today, is plant the seed with people about what you need to be thinking about it in match, and really to let you know that, like I said, the details on all of them, each funder will tell you specifically. It's not sort of a hidden secret. It's pretty publicly available information about how they're going to look at match and how it's going to work, but it's important to start thinking about it ahead of time and getting a little bit of help where you need it. So with that, I'm going to pipe up and close my mouth for a minute and ask if anybody has questions on what we've gone over today, match in general, anything on your mind. Okay. So maybe that means we did a great job. Maybe that means we did a terrible job. So you'll have to let us know on that. But I also wanted to just say match can be really specific, right? And I think match is a little bit, like, I'm going to make a strange comment, like dirty laundry. Not everybody always wants to talk about it out loud on their project, right? Of how do I do this? What's going on? Both Kat and my emails are at the bottom of the screen. A lot of you also know our executive director, Michelle Morin Gray, but we're always here to help answer questions for you around match, help you find where to find those details in those funding opportunity notices and things like that. And I just sort of recommend to you all, when you're working on your projects, reach out. Feel free to reach out to us, reach out to somebody else who you know has successfully used that funding before, and really start asking your match questions early, because it's always important to kind of get out ahead of it. Thank you guys all for your time joining us today. I'll see if anybody else has any more questions, but if not, we will wrap things up and wish you all a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you all very much. And like I said, feel free to pick up the email, call us if you have specific questions today, or, that's an open invitation. At any point, we're always here to help you guys think about, how to put this all together. So have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very informative.
Thanks, Vicki. See you all.